The Dark Dawn, the beginnings of the Holocaust. Tonight, we embark on a journey through one of the darkest chapters in human history. A chapter that began not with the crack of gunfire or the march of armies, but with words, laws, and the slow erosion of humanity. The Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers. It did not begin with mass deportations. It began with ideas rooted in hatred, in exclusion, in the belief that some lives were worth less than others.
On a day in April 1945, the townspeople of Gardelegen, Germany, carried 1,100 crosses to a local barn. The crosses were for 1,100 fresh graves, the victims of Gardelegen. But these 1,100 were a small fraction of the 20 million men, women, and children murdered by the Nazis. 20 million human beings, equal to the population of 22 American states. 20 million corpses, the product of 300 concentration camps all over Germany and in occupied territories.
It began with a man named Adolf Hitler, who rose to power in Germany in 1933, carrying with him a vision of racial purity and national supremacy. It began with a government that embraced his ideology, turning prejudice into policy and policy into persecution. So we will walk through the early years, the years when the foundation was laid, when the world watched, when the warnings were ignored.
Covering 20 cities in 7 days. 5 election campaigns were fought in one single year. Hitler was intent on destroying democracy by taking advantage of democratic means. Hitler over Germany. This ambiguous slogan was used to advertise the tour. To some it spelt out a threat, to others it meant salvation. One fact became increasingly clear as his campaign progressed. Nothing could stop Hitler now. His vision was unmatched by any other politician. He seemed omnipresent. It was almost uncanny. And this helped promote the idea that he was not so much a politician as some sort of messiah. But it was all engineered with military precision. 1932 was the year of Hitler's most spectacularly successful speeches. It was also the year in which the Nazi Party became the most powerful in the country. What appealed most to people was his promise that everything was going to be different. Time and again, he would tell them that he shared in their problems, that he understood their anxieties. He was one of them. Life had been no kinder to him than to them. And like them, he had turned to politics out of a sense of desperation. He was indefatigable, constantly on the move. Hitler himself spoke of those years of incessant chasing around, chasing after new converts. He would travel anywhere to meet them. Goebbels spoke rather pompously of a world record in personal encounters. Hitler left the people in no doubt about his intentions.
Wir sind intolerant. Ich habe mir ein Ziel gesteckt, nämlich die 30 Parteien aus Deutschland hinauszufegen. Sie verwechseln mich immer mit einem bürgerlichen oder einem marxistischen Politiker, der heute SPD ist und morgen USPD und übermorgen KPD und dann Syndikalist oder heute Demokrat und morgen Deutsche Volkspartei und dann wieder Wirtschaftspartei. Sie verwechseln uns mit ihresgleichen selbst. Wir haben ein Ziel uns gewählt und verfechten es fanatisch, rücksichtslos bis ins Grab hinein.
That was his aim, to tear down social barriers. All were to free themselves of their conventional ties and be united in a new community of the people. Any man who put his trust in Hitler could count on his protection. The frightened middle classes, the working man, or the unemployed. His energetic platitudes were directed at everybody.
Etwas zunehmen! Regierungen kommen und gehen! Das Volk ist das Bleibende!
The Republican government was powerless to stem the growing tide of chaos. Its supporters kept out of sight, leaving the police to fight the government's battles against the enemies of the state. Stormtroopers under arrest in Berlin. Hitler over Germany. His goal was in sight. His subordinates were waiting at the airfield, Göring and the leader of the stormtroopers, Ernst Röhm. Hitler's audience now numbered hundreds of thousands. People had no idea that the party was in the throes of a major crisis. The National Socialists had been rejected at the last election, the party leadership was divided, and there were financial problems. For Hitler, this was all the more reason to step up his smear campaign.
Sie reden nicht von den Zehntausenden, die Jahr für Jahr den Gashahn aufdrehen, nicht weil es ihnen zu gut geht.
He was still determined to bring about the downfall of the Republic. He left no one in any doubt about that.
Eine solche Bewegung aus nichts geschaffen worden. Sie können uns unterdrücken. Sie können uns meinetwegen töten. Kapitulieren werden wir nicht.
In January 1933, the Republic was finished. Yet all Hitler's energy, all his inflammatory speeches, were not in themselves enough to carry him to power. It took the resignation of his opponents to give him what he wanted.
The rise of Nazi Germany, 1933 to 1935. It is January 30th, 1933. The world is watching as Adolf Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany.
1933 marks the beginning of the darkest chapter in German history. Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist Party assume power in Germany. Since that time, the image of Germany and the Germans in the world has changed, and the shadows of the past are omnipresent even today.
Hitler was not an ordinary politician. Right from the start, he felt that the German people had to be redeemed.
Adolf Hitler is appointed Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933. Once the Nazis take over the fates of Germany, they hold on to power until the downfall on the 8th of May 1945.
Tonight we turn back the clock to a moment in history that changed the course of the world forever. A moment when democracy crumbled, when fear triumphed over reason, and when a single man seized control of a nation desperate for salvation. This is the story of how Adolf Hitler rose to power. It did not happen overnight. It did not happen in secret. It happened in broad daylight, in the halls of government, in the streets of Berlin, in the minds of millions who believed that he alone could restore Germany's greatness.
Hitler's rule begins with great hopes and unprecedented jubilation.
What was unique about the Third Reich was that it brought about the most profound destruction of civilization that's ever been encountered, and this was because the Third Reich set out to destroy the values which had existed for 2,000 years, values associated with Judeo-Christian civilization, that this was a revolutionary attempt to upturn those values.
The way the totalitarian regime takes control of the entire nation within a few years is unprecedented.
January 30th, 1933. The world watched as he was appointed Chancellor of Germany. But how did we get there? How did a failed artist, a soldier wounded in World War I, a man once dismissed as a radical fringe figure, rise to the highest office in the land? To understand, we must go back. The Weimar Republic, a nation in crisis. Germany, in the aftermath of World War I, was a nation in turmoil. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed crushing reparations, stripping Germany of its military strength, its territories, and its dignity.
In Germany, Kapp is in Berlin. He basically organized the troops around the capital and tried to seize power. And he actually did seize power for a few days, but then the Social Democrats and the Communists, they did what happened in Russia during Kornilov Putsch. The workers' detachments just kind of armed themselves and began to fight against the general, and then there was a general strike. The whole city was paralyzed by workers' action, and the Kapp Putsch collapsed.
The people were suffering. Inflation soared. The economy collapsed. The streets were filled with protest, hunger, and desperation. And in the midst of this chaos, a new government was born, the Weimar Republic, a fragile democracy struggling to hold itself together. But democracy was weak. The people did not trust it. They longed for stability, for strength, for a leader who could restore order. And in the shadows, Adolf Hitler was waiting.
So it was one more reminder that that neither the leftist putsch nor the rightist putsch succeeded. In other words, you have the communist uprising in Bavaria suppressed, and then you have the Kapp Putsch suppressed. The Weimar Republic survived. The democratic form of government through the representative institutions of the Reichstag, the parliament, survived these two blows. So why does that happen? It happens because the Germans are unable, this is their explanation, unwilling is the French explanation, to pay reparations. There's this very heavy load of payments that they have to do in accordance with Versailles Treaty, and they are not doing it to the satisfaction of the French.
The Nazi Party's rise. Hitler joined the German Workers' Party in 1919, a small nationalist group that would soon become the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party. He was not a politician. He was a speaker, a manipulator, a man who could turn anger into action and fear into loyalty.
Hitler cannot assert his power without war. His vision is to rule the entire world. His hatred of Jews knows no limits. Jewish citizens are ostracized from the national community, persecuted and ultimately methodically murdered in death factories.
The entire National Socialist history is about radicalizations. They only hazarded one step at a time, and then another, and another. And in wartime, it's a lot easier to enforce radical measures.
By 1923, he attempted to overthrow the government in the Beer Hall Putsch, a failed coup that landed him in prison. But prison did not break him, it made him stronger. It gave him time to write Mein Kampf, his manifesto of hate, his blueprint for power. And when he emerged, Germany was weaker than ever. The Great Depression of 1929 shattered the economy. Millions were unemployed. The people were desperate. And Hitler promised them salvation. The election of 1932. Now it's 1932, and Germany is at a crossroads. The people must choose their future. Hitler runs for president against Paul von Hindenburg, the Asian war hero. He loses, but the Nazi Party is growing. In the July 1932 elections, the Nazis win 37% of the vote, becoming the largest party in Reichstag. But Hitler is not yet chancellor. He demands power, and he refuses to compromise. And in the chaos of political infighting, in the desperation of leaders who fear civil war, Hindenburg appoints Hitler as chancellor on January 30th, 1933.
In the spring of 1933, the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda stages a march by members of the stormtroopers at the Brandenburg Gate with a film camera. The resulting motion picture reenacts the night in which Hitler assumed power in Germany. The Third Reich is only a few months old, and already the Nazi leaders are beginning to glorify their own history. On the morning of the 30th of January 1933, Adolf Hitler leaves Hotel Kaiserhof in Berlin among a cheering crowd of supporters. At 11 o'clock, he is to be appointed Chancellor of Germany by Reich President von Hindenburg. This day will become a turning point in the history of the 20th century.
The world watches, and the world does not act. The fall of democracy, the Reichstag fire, and the Enabling Act. It's February 27, 1933. The Reichstag burns. The Nazis blame the communists. They use fear to seize control. And on March 23, 1933, the Enabling Act is passed, giving Hitler absolute power.
Franz von Papen is at Hitler's side during the presentation of the new cabinet. The National Conservative Vice-Chancellor believes he can keep Hitler in check and maintains, "We've hired him."
Hitler didn't have any blueprint in mind at that time. His main ideas were to get new elections, following the elections to have an enabling act, and to acquire power in the various Länder, in the various states like Bavaria and Saxony, and finally, of course, obviously to destroy his internal enemies. I think those were the main points that Hitler had in mind when he took power in 1933. Beyond that, no clear idea of how things would develop.
To celebrate Hitler's appointment, gangs of the stormtroopers march through the Brandenburg Gate and into Berlin's government district in the evening. Reich President von Hindenburg can be seen as a faint silhouette at the window. A journalist of the time prophetically comments that Hitler's appointment as Reich Chancellor equals a leap into darkness.
This begins the worst chapter in German history. Democracy is dead, and Germany belongs to him. Hitler did not seize power in secret. He was elected. He was appointed. He was given control by those who believed they could contain him.
Having been appointed the new Interior Minister of Prussia, Hermann Göring is in control of the police. Hitler's unscrupulous advocate is determined to exploit his power without mercy.
Ich werde mit eisernem Besen auskehren und alle diejenigen, die ausschließlich wegen ihrer roten oder schwarzen Gesinnung und zur Unterdrückung aller nationalen Bestrebungen in Amt und Würden sitzen, hinausfegen.
A re-election is scheduled for the 5th of March. On the 10th of February, the Nazis organize a political rally where they declare war on the communists. Hitler's appearance is filmed and screened in cinemas all over Germany.
He had this great love for the German people, And he managed to convey this skillfully in his speeches. People saw in him their redeemer, with virtually religious overtones. He was someone who was saying to them, I know things are really bad for you, unemployment is very high, but you still have something special. You are members of the German people. And all the other peoples who are not German are not as worthy as you are.
But they were wrong, and the world paid the price. Tyranny does not always come with violence. Sometimes it comes with votes. Now the streets of Berlin are alive with celebration among his supporters. But beneath the surface, a storm is brewing.
Berlin, the 1st of April 1933. The day on which the brutality of the new era manifests itself openly for the first time. Hitler's cabinet has called for a countrywide boycott of Jewish shops.
The actual boycott was a shock for Germans. It all happened out of the blue. One day, people in uniform were standing outside the shops and wouldn't let anybody in. It was an overt message to the Jewish citizens all over Germany that they couldn't be part of the national community because they belong to another race or don't have the right ancestry.
Contrary to the claims of the propaganda machinery, the boycott is not particularly successful. Many customers simply ignore the posters and signs of the stormtroopers. For German Jews, however, the day will become a traumatic memory.
In Berlin, wie in anderen Universitätsstädten Deutschlands, wurden undeutsche und unsittliche Bücher von den Studenten eingesammelt und öffentlich verbrannt. Der Scheiterhaufen auf dem Opernplatz in Berlin.
Within weeks, the Nazi regime begins its transformation of Germany. March 22, 1933, the first official Nazi concentration camp opens in Dachu. Dachu, the first Nazi concentration camp. We're turning our attention to a place that becomes synonymous with terror. A place where the foundations of Nazi brutality were laid, where the first prisoners were taken, and where the machinery of oppression began its relentless march toward genocide. This is the story of Dachu, the first Nazi concentration camp. It is not yet a death camp, but it is a place of terror, a place where political opponents, communists and socialists, are imprisoned.
On a day in April 1945, the townspeople of Gardelegen, Germany, carried 1,100 crosses to a local barn. The crosses were for 1,100 fresh graves, the victims of Gardelegen. But these 1,100 were a small fraction of the 20 million men, women, and children murdered by the Nazis. 20 million human beings, equal to the population of 22 American states. 20 million corpses, the product of 300 concentration camps all over Germany and in occupied territories. Death mills that ground out their dead until the very day Allied armies broke through their gates. Those who survived could answer the roll call of all the nations of Europe, of all religious faiths, of all political beliefs, condemned by Hitler because they were anti-Nazi. And now they were free. The liberators had smashed through the barbed wire at Dachau, at Buchenwald, at Ohrdruf, at Belsen, at Sachsenhausen, at Ebensee, and Ravensbrück. Many were freed only to die. Years of imprisonment, starvation, torture, and forced labor had broken them. They had been beaten down to live like animals. Far worse, for few animals had lived in the terror, hunger, and filth of these victims. People who once had been human beings, like you and me. When the Allies came, survivors were taken out of dungeons where rats had been their companions and vermin their bedfellows. Despite the desperate efforts of Allied doctors and medical aids, help came too late for many.
They are marched into the camp, stripped of their dignity, and subjected to brutal treatment. The Nazis called Dachu a re-education camp, a place to break the will of those who oppose them, but in reality, it's a place of terror. And the brutality begins. From the moment Dachu opens, it becomes a testing ground for Nazi cruelty. Prisoners live in constant fear. They endure beatings, forced labor, and psychological torment. The SS guards, under the command of Theodor Eicke, established a system of absolute control, a system that will later be replicated in every concentration camp across Nazi-occupied Europe.
In the hell of Auschwitz, Allied physicians study marks of the Nazi beast. First was General Eisenhower, who visited Ohrdruf. The inmates demonstrate the Bach, a torture instrument with which they were well acquainted. This was just one of many torture devices of Himmler's henchmen. Military leaders were followed by church dignitaries like the Archbishop of Canterbury. Such as dungeons where this sort of atrocity, 5 with operations in each box, was routine. Everywhere was the repeated, monotonous sight and stench of corpses. Shriveled bodies like old bones picked over by dogs. Piles and heaps like the litter of a boneyard. These are the foul, wretched remnants of human beings. Human beings like you and me.
Eicke introduced standing cells, where prisoners are forced to stand for hours, sometimes days, in tiny spaces. He orders floggings, tree hangings, and long periods of forced standing at attention. The message is clear: resistance will not be tolerated. The expansion of Dachu. As the years pass, Dachu grows. It is no longer just a camp for political prisoners. It becomes a forced labor camp, a prison for Jews, Romani, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Catholic priests, and foreign nationals. By the time the war reaches its final years, Dachu has expanded into a network of nearly 100 subcamps, stretching across southern Germany and Austria. The brutality intensifies and the death toll rises, and yet the world watches. The world does not act.
Not all died slowly and horribly by starvation. Millions died quickly and horribly by burning in the furnaces of Poland. This is what is left of their agony, a handful of ash to swirl into oblivion on a puff of wind. Gas chambers were the principal agent of death, and their use was admirably organized. Prisoners were told to prepare themselves for a shower bath. They were even given towels to make them believe this story. But when the doors of the bathroom were closed behind them, poison gas, Zyklon, was released through the shower ducts. In Dachau, in Auschwitz, in Nordhausen, in Majdanek, the German Murder Trust standardized the procedure of slaughter. The death gas was always the same, Zyklon. Cremation was the chief means of disposal of the great mass of bodies. Auschwitz alone had 4 of them going night and day, like the blast furnaces of Pittsburgh. Having been put to all this expense of murder, the Nazis were determined to make a profit. The charred remains were ground up and sold to German farmers as fertilizer. The death mills were made to pay in many ways. Thousands of garments were stripped from prisoners.
The beginning of a nightmare. Dachu was the first, but it was not the last. It was the blueprint, the model, for Auschwitz, the Treblinka, and for Bergen-Belsen. It was the beginning of a nightmare that would claim 6 million Jewish lives, along with millions of others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime.
Women's clothes, infant shoes, even toys and dolls. Human hair, women's hair, cut before death dulled its luster. Methodically packed, it was ready for sale to manufacturers. Every murder mill had its storage room, like this one at Buchenwald. Each contained jewelry, watches, wedding rings, heaps of eyeglasses and gold teeth, torn from the mouth of the dead. These were the instruments used to pull the teeth. In their slaughterhouse, the Nazi butchers wasted as little of the body as possible. When Allied armies approached, the Nazis often tried to rush their prisoners elsewhere. Thousands were suffocated in overcrowded freight cars. Many of the dead and the dying were flung into the water.
So we remember the first prisoners, the men who stood against tyranny and paid the price. And we remember the warning signs that were ignored, and we vow never again. The road to genocide, 1939 to 1941. It is September 1st, 1939. Germany invades Poland, and World War II begins. With war comes new horrors. The Nazi established ghettos, forcing Jews into overcrowded, disease-ridden districts. June 1941, Germany invades the Soviet Union. The Eisengruppen, Nazi mobile killing squads, begin mass executions of Jews. September 1941, the Babi Yar massacre. In just 2 days, 33,771 Jews are murdered in the ravine outside Kiev. The world watches, and the world does not act. The Holocaust did not happen overnight. It was built step by step, law by law, and silence by silence. It began with words, and it ended with 6 million murdered.
If the Allies moved too rapidly, the Nazis attempted to kill their prisoners so that no witnesses of their crimes were left behind. In Majdanek, in Ohrdruf, in many other camps, thousands were murdered just before liberation. This man was killed with a bayonet. Here's a typical German barn at Gardelegen. 1,100 human beings were herded into it and burned alive. Those who in their anguish broke out were shot as they emerged. What subhumans did these things? Here's one captured at Mauthausen.
We remember the warnings that were ignored, and we remember the lives that were lost, and we vow never again. Follow for part 2, where I move on in the Holocaust to the beginning of World War II. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you for taking a walk with me and looking at the Holocaust. Have a good night, guys.